Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most misunderstood job title in feudal Japan, the Harakiri girl. Now before your mind goes to dark places, let me tell you that these women weren't what you think they were, and their story is equal parts hilarious and heartbreaking. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into a world where honor was everything, death was theatrical, and some women made a living out of other people's dramatic exits. Let's start with the biggest misconception about Harakiri girls in feudal Japan. Most people assumed these were women who committed ritual suicide themselves, or perhaps assisted in the deaths of others in some gruesome capacity. In reality, Harakiri girls were professional mourners, actresses and ritual specialists who helped stage and dramatize seppuku ceremonies, and they were very much alive and often quite wealthy from their unusual profession. Think of them as the ultimate event planners for the world's most intense farewell parties. These weren't tragic figures throwing their lives away. They were savvy businesswomen who turned Japan's obsession with honorable death into a thriving career. It's like being a wedding planner, except instead of "till death do us part," it was more "death is the whole point, and please make sure my kimono doesn't wrinkle when I fall." This wasn't some romantic cherry blossom petals falling gracefully while someone writes poetry situation that Hollywood loves to portray. It was a carefully choreographed performance with specific protocols, precise timing, and professional standards that would make a Broadway director weep with envy. And at the center of it all were these remarkable women who somehow managed to make a living ensuring that people died with style, dignity, and just the right amount of dramatic flair. The Edo period wasn't the peaceful Zen garden paradise that modern tourism brochures might suggest. It was a pressure cooker of social expectations where your reputation could literally be a matter of life and death. Medieval Japan wasn't a place where you could just shrug off a bad day at work or laugh off a social faux pas. If you dishonored yourself, your family, or your lord, the culturally acceptable response was often to disembowel yourself in front of witnesses while reciting poetry, because apparently nothing says "I'm sorry" quite like ritualized suicide with a literary component. The samurai class controlled everything that mattered, and they had elevated the concept of saving face to an art form that would make modern social media influencers look emotionally stable. Honor wasn't just important, it was the entire foundation of society, and losing it meant you were basically dead to everyone anyway, so you might as well make it official and at least die with some ceremony. If you thought modern Japanese culture was intense, imagine a world where a single mistake at your job could result in your boss expecting you to commit suicide to restore balance to the universe. And not just any suicide, a very specific, ritualized suicide that required proper witnesses, correct positioning, appropriate clothing, and ideally some profound last words that people would remember for generations. This created a bizarre market. Demand, if you're going to die ceremonially, you want to do it right. You need someone who knows the protocols, someone who can ensure everything goes according to tradition, someone who can handle the logistics while you focus on the existential weight of your final moments. Enter the Harakiri girls, women who saw this cultural obsession and thought, you know what, I can make this my whole career. Meet Hanako of Kyoto, one of the most famous Harakiri girls of the late Edo period, who allegedly attended over 300 seppuku ceremonies in her 40-year career. Hanako wasn't born into this profession. She started as a tea house entertainer who happened to be present during a particularly botched ritual suicide attempt, where the participant kept hesitating, the witnesses were getting uncomfortable, and nobody seemed to know what was supposed to happen next. But here's the twist that makes Hanako's story so fascinating. She wasn't just observing the chaos. She took charge. She calmly walked over, straightened the man's kimono, reminded him of the proper hand position, whispered some encouraging words about the beauty of cherry blossoms, and somehow managed to turn what was becoming an embarrassing social disaster into a dignified farewell that had witnesses wiping away tears and nodding in approval. Word spread quickly through Kyoto's social networks, which, let's be honest, were probably more efficient than most modern communication systems. Soon, families were specifically requesting Hanako's presence at their relatives' final moments. She developed a reputation for knowing exactly how to arrange the ceremonial items, how to coach nervous participants through their final speeches, and most importantly, how to handle the awkward logistics that nobody ever talked about, but everyone worried about. Hanako charged premium rates, reportedly earning more per ceremony than many samurai made in a month. She employed a small team of assistants, maintained relationships with the best swordsmiths for ceremonial blades, and even offered package deals that included post-ceremony memorial services. Think of her as the Martha Stewart of ritual death. Everything had to be perfect, tasteful, and executed with precision that would honor the deceased and impress the witnesses. And if you think that's remarkable, wait until you hear about her. Innovation in what she called practice sessions, non-fatal rehearsals, where nervous clients could run through the ceremony multiple times to work out any kinks before the real event. Because apparently even in death, practice makes perfect, and nobody wanted to fumble their final moment in front of important witnesses. This wasn't just about theatrical death or unusual career choices. The Harakiri girls represented something much more complex about Japanese society. They were women finding economic independence and social respect in a world that offered them very few opportunities for either. In a culture where women were expected to be invisible and dependent, these professionals carved out a niche where their expertise was not just valued, but essential. The stakes were enormous for everyone involved. For the person committing seppuku, a poorly executed ceremony could dishonor their family for generations. For the witnesses, being present at a bungled ritual could reflect poorly on their judgment and social standing. For the families, the ceremony was often their last chance to restore honor and dignity to their name. And for the Harakiri girls, their reputation and livelihood depended on ensuring that everything went flawlessly every single time. This created a unique dynamic where these women held incredible power in their society's most solemn moments. They were trusted with secrets, confessions, and final wishes. They became confidants to some of the most powerful people in Japan during their most vulnerable moments. Some Harakiri girls reportedly knew more political secrets than government officials, simply because people tell the truth when they think they're about to die. But the complexity goes even deeper. These women were simultaneously celebrated and marginalized, essential and controversial, wealthy and socially precarious. They operated in the spaces between life and death, between honor and shame, between tradition and innovation. But Hanako and her profession were just the beginning of a much stranger story. The world of professional death assistants was far more elaborate and competitive than anyone might imagine, with rival schools of technique, political intrigue, and enough workplace drama to fill a modern reality TV series. As we'll discover, the Harakiri girls developed their own hierarchies, their own training methods, and their own fierce debates about proper protocol. Some specialized in warrior suicides, others in merchant-class ceremonies, and a few elite practitioners were called upon for the most politically sensitive cases where discretion was as important as expertise. The business of dying honorably had become, quite literally, a business, complete with apprenticeships, professional rivalry, trade secrets, and enough behind-the-scenes maneuvering to make a medieval soap opera writer weep with joy. And trust me, when we dive deeper into this world, you'll discover that truth really is stranger than fiction. The professional death assistance industry in feudal Japan was unlike anything the world had seen before or since. Unlike our modern assumption that death was a private family affair handled by religious authorities, the reality was that ritual suicide had become such a cornerstone of Japanese culture that it required its own specialized workforce, complete with guilds, apprenticeships, and professional standards that would make modern corporate training programs look casual. This developed because seppuku wasn't just about dying, it was about dying correctly, beautifully, and in a way that would be remembered and discussed for generations. The difference between a well-executed ceremony and a botched one could determine whether your family name was restored to honor or forever associated with an embarrassing display that people would whisper about at dinner parties for decades. Think of it like this: if you were getting married, you'd want a wedding planner who knew about flowers, catering, music, and timing. If you were committing ritual suicide in feudal Japan, you wanted someone who understood blade angles, kimono arrangement, witness positioning, last word coaching, and the subtle art of making disembowelment look as graceful as a tea ceremony. The Harakiri girls filled this niche with the same professionalism that modern event planners bring to bar mitzvahs, except with significantly higher stakes and considerably more blood. What made this industry particularly fascinating was how it operated parallel to the official samurai culture while serving essential functions that the formal system couldn't provide. The samurai code was very specific about honor and death, but surprisingly vague about the practical details of actually executing a perfect ceremony. The Harakiri girls filled that gap, becoming the unsung experts who made the whole system work smoothly. Take the case of Toshiro, a mid-ranking samurai who had accidentally insulted his daimyo by serving tea at the wrong temperature during a crucial political meeting. In modern times, this might result in an awkward apology and maybe some workplace tension. In feudal Japan, it was a career-ending dishonor that demanded seppuku to restore balance to the social order. Toshiro hired Midori, one of Kyoto's most respected Harakiri girls, for what should have been a straightforward ceremony. But here's where it gets interesting. Toshiro had a secret phobia of sharp objects and kept fainting during the preliminary consultations. Midori, displaying the kind of customer service skills that would make modern hospitality professionals weep with envy, developed an innovative solution. She arranged for a series of meditation sessions, gradually introduced dulled practice blades, and even brought in a monk who specialized in courage enhancement through spiritual visualization. One witness reportedly described the final ceremony as the most graceful death I have ever observed, noting that Toshiro moved through the ritual with calm precision that would have been impossible without Midori's extensive preparation. The same witness mentioned that Midori had positioned herself in such a way that she could provide subtle coaching through eye contact and hand gestures, essentially serving as a death doula while maintaining the illusion that Toshiro was acting entirely on his own initiative. Another remarkable example involved Sachiko, a Harakiri girl who specialized in merchant class ceremonies, which were considered more complex because merchants weren't trained in martial traditions and often had no idea how to handle a sword properly. One particularly memorable case involved a silk trader who had been caught embezzling from his guild and needed to restore his family's honor through seppuku. The problem was that this merchant was so unfamiliar with blade work that he couldn't even figure out how to hold the tanto properly without cutting himself prematurely. Sachiko spent 3 weeks teaching him basic sword handling, proper sitting posture, and breathing techniques. She even arranged for him to practice the ceremony using a wooden replica until his muscle memory was perfect. But the most brilliant part of Sachiko's approach was her innovation in what she called dignity preservation protocols. She realized that many non-samurai clients were terrified not just of dying, but of looking foolish or incompetent in their final moments. So she developed a system of subtle cues and positioning that would allow her to guide clients through the ceremony while making it appear that they were acting with natural expertise. The merchant's final ceremony was attended by over 50 witnesses, including several samurai who later commented that they had rarely seen such composure and grace from someone of the merchant class. What they didn't know was that Sachiko had choreographed nearly every movement, coached every word, and positioned herself to provide constant guidance while remaining virtually invisible to the audience. These weren't isolated success stories. They represented a pattern of innovation and professionalism that characterized the entire industry. Harakiri girls developed specialized techniques for different client types: warriors who needed help overcoming battle injuries that affected their mobility, scholars who wanted their deaths to be particularly poetic, merchants who required extra coaching in samurai protocols, and even teenage clients who were too young to have developed the emotional control expected during such ceremonies. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in feudal Japan ever was. The Harakiri girls operated in a legal and social grey area that created constant complications. Officially, they didn't exist. The samurai code insisted that true honor came from within and couldn't be purchased or coached. Admitting that you needed professional help to die properly would undermine the entire philosophical foundation of the ceremony. This created a fascinating contradiction. Everyone knew about the Harakiri girls, everyone used their services, but nobody could officially acknowledge their existence. It was like having a thriving industry of professional death coaches that society simultaneously depended on and pretended didn't exist. The complications got even messier when you consider the religious aspects. Buddhist authorities generally disapproved of suicide, but couldn't openly oppose seppuku because it was so deeply embedded in samurai culture. Some monks would refuse to provide funeral services for people who had used Harakiri girls, claiming their deaths were artificially enhanced rather than naturally honorable. Other religious leaders quietly hired Harakiri girls themselves when family members needed to commit suicide, creating a web of hypocrisy that would make modern political scandals look straightforward. Then there were the economic contradictions. Harakiri girls could become quite wealthy, but their wealth came from death, which created social awkwardness around their prosperity. Some communities celebrated their success as businesswomen, while others viewed their wealth as somehow tainted by its association with suicide. A few Harakiri girls reportedly had to donate significant portions of their earnings to temples and charities to maintain social acceptance. The gender dynamics were particularly complex. These were some of the few women in feudal Japan who operated independent businesses, negotiated their own contracts, and accumulated personal wealth. But their expertise was in death, not life, which complicated their social status in ways that had no precedent. Were they empowered entrepreneurs, or were they trapped in a profession that literally revolved around helping people die? The answer seemed to depend on who you asked and what day of the week it was. The result was a shadow economy that became increasingly sophisticated and organized, even as it remained officially invisible. Harakiri girls began forming loose associations, not quite guilds, but definitely professional networks where they could share techniques, refer clients to specialists, and establish standardized pricing. Some regions developed their own styles and specializations. Kyoto Harakiri girls were known for their aesthetic refinement and poetic sensibilities. Edo practitioners were more practical and efficient, focusing on quick, clean ceremonies with minimal fuss. Rural Harakiri girls often doubled as general ceremonial assistants, helping with everything from weddings to funeral preparations, making them essential community resources rather than just death specialists. The institutional reactions were predictably confused and contradictory. Local governments couldn't regulate an industry that didn't officially exist, but they also couldn't ignore the social and economic impacts. Some jurisdictions tried to ban the practice, which mainly succeeded in driving it underground and making it more expensive. Others attempted to license Harakiri girls as general ceremony assistants, carefully avoiding any direct mention of their death-related services. The samurai class was deeply conflicted about the whole situation. Many individual samurai were grateful for the Harakiri girls' services and privately recommended specific practitioners to friends and family. But the broader samurai culture couldn't acknowledge this dependence without undermining their claims to natural honor and innate warrior wisdom. Perhaps most significantly, the Harakiri girls began to influence the broader culture of death and ceremony in Japan. Their innovations in choreography, witness management, and emotional preparation started appearing in other types of rituals. Some of their techniques for managing anxiety and maintaining dignity under extreme pressure were quietly adopted by samurai schools and incorporated into broader martial arts training. This created a feedback loop where the unofficial death industry was actually improving the official culture of honor and ceremony, but nobody could openly discuss or acknowledge these improvements. It was like having a secret curriculum that was making everyone better at the very things they claimed to already know perfectly. Meanwhile, the competitive pressures within the Harakiri girl community were creating their own drama and innovation. As word spread about the most skilled practitioners, rivalries developed between different schools of approach, leading to what can only be described as professional disputes over the proper techniques for helping people die with maximum dignity. These weren't just disagreements about methodology, they were fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of death, honor, and the role of women in maintaining social stability. Some Harakiri girls believed in minimal intervention, providing only basic guidance and allowing clients to find their own path to honorable death. Others developed elaborate systems of preparation, training, and ceremonial enhancement that turned seppuku into a form of performance art. The competition between these different approaches would drive innovation, create political intrigue, and occasionally result in what can only be called professional sabotage in the world's most unusual industry. And trust me, when we explore these rivalries, you'll discover that workplace drama takes on entirely new dimensions when your job involves helping people die gracefully. If the business of death assistance was surprisingly sophisticated, then the professional rivalries within the Harakiri girl community were absolutely cutthroat, which is probably the most appropriate adjective possible for this situation. Unlike the collaborative atmosphere you might expect from people dealing with life's most solemn moments, the reality was that different schools of Harakiri girls viewed each other with the kind of competitive intensity usually reserved for rival Yakuza clans or modern tech companies fighting over market share. This became important because as the industry matured, distinct philosophical approaches emerged that weren't just about technique, they represented fundamentally different views about death, dignity, and the proper role of professional assistance in what was supposed to be the most personal of human experiences. Some practitioners believed that too much help undermined the spiritual authenticity of the act, while others argued that maximum assistance was actually more honorable because it ensured the ceremony would be worthy of the sacrifice being made. The stakes weren't just professional pride either. In a society where reputation was everything, being associated with a poorly executed seppuku could destroy a Harakiri girl's career overnight. This meant that different schools weren't just competing. For clients, they were actively trying to discredit each other's methods, poach each other's most skilled practitioners, and establish their approaches as the authentic or traditional way of handling ritual death. What made this particularly fascinating was that these were some of the most empowered, independent women in feudal Japan engaging in the kind of sophisticated business warfare that would make modern corporate strategists take notes. They were fighting for market dominance in an industry that officially didn't exist, using tactics that had to be subtle enough to avoid disrupting the social pretense that their services weren't actually necessary. Consider the legendary rivalry between the Kyoto elegance school, led by the formidable Tomoe, and the Edo efficiency movement, championed by the equally formidable Yuki. These two women represented completely opposite approaches to death assistance, and their professional competition became the stuff of legend throughout Japan's underground ceremonial networks. Tomoe believed that seppuku should be transformed into something approaching high art. Her ceremonies were elaborate affairs that could take hours, with careful attention to seasonal flowers, appropriate poetry readings, musical accompaniment, and what she called aesthetic harmony between the participants' final moments and the eternal beauty of nature. Her clients often spent weeks in preparation, learning not just the physical techniques but also meditation practices, calligraphy for their death poems, and even specialized breathing exercises designed to maintain composure during disembowelment. One of Tomoe's most famous ceremonies involved a young samurai who had lost face by falling off his horse during a parade. Tomoe turned his seppuku into what witnesses described as a meditation on the impermanence of worldly dignity. She arranged for the ceremony to take place in a garden where the cherry blossoms were just beginning to fall, positioned musicians to provide subtle accompaniment, and coached the young man through a death poem that became so celebrated it was later included in poetry anthologies. Yuki, on the other hand, believed that all this elaborate preparation and artistic enhancement was actually dishonoring the true spirit of seppuku. Her Edo efficiency movement focused on what she called pure death, ceremonies that were quick, clean, and focused entirely on the participants' inner resolve rather than external pageantry. Her clients received intensive but brief training in technique and mental preparation, then participated in ceremonies that typically lasted less than an hour and emphasized the participants' natural courage rather than artificial enhancements. Competition between these approaches came to a head during what became known as the Autumn Incident, when both schools were hired by different branches of the same samurai family to handle ceremonies for two brothers who had been involved in the same dishonoring event. The ceremonies were scheduled for the same day in different parts of Edo, creating what was essentially a head-to-head competition between the two philosophical approaches. Tomme's ceremony for the elder brother was a masterpiece of aesthetic coordination. She had arranged for the garden to be specially prepared with imported flowers, commissioned original music, and spent days coaching the participant through what became a legendary death poem comparing his sacrifice to the setting sun reflecting on still water. The ceremony lasted 3 hours and left witnesses emotionally overwhelmed by its beauty and solemnity. Yuki's ceremony for the younger brother took place in a simple room with minimal decoration. She had trained the participant in pure technique and mental focus, emphasizing his personal courage and family honor rather than artistic expression. The ceremony lasted 45 minutes and was described by witnesses as the most genuinely honorable death they had ever observed. The aftermath of the Autumn Incident created a crisis in the Harakiri girl community. Both ceremonies were universally praised, but for completely different reasons. Supporters of each approach claimed victory, while neutral observers argued that the competition had actually proved that both methods could be equally effective. This led to what can only be described as a philosophical schism in the professional death assistance community, with practitioners forced to choose sides in what became known as the style wars. The competition escalated to the point where practitioners from rival schools would attempt to sabotage each other's ceremonies. There are documented cases of elegance school practitioners spreading rumors about efficiency practitioners being too rushed and lacking in proper respect for tradition. Meanwhile, efficiency practitioners accused elegance practitioners of turning sacred death into theatrical performance and caring more about impressing witnesses than honoring the deceased. Things got so heated that some regions actually experienced what could only be called death coach battles, where rival practitioners would show up at the same ceremony and argue about proper technique in front of horrified witnesses. One particularly notorious incident involved a ceremony being delayed for 2 hours while competing Harakiri girls debated the proper angle for blade positioning, completely undermining the solemnity of the occasion and leaving the person attempting seppuku sitting awkwardly while professionals argued about the best way to help him die. This wasn't isolated professional drama. It represented a larger pattern in Japanese society, where even the most sacred traditions became subject to innovation, competition, and commercialization. The Harakiri girl rivalries were actually part of a broader trend, where traditional practices were being refined, systematized, and professionalized in ways that would have been impossible in earlier periods. The pattern extended beyond death. Assistance to other ceremonial professions. Tea ceremony masters developed competing schools with different approaches to hospitality and aesthetics. Martial arts instructors created rival traditions, claiming to teach the true way of the warrior. Even Buddhist monks competed over whose meditation techniques were most effective for achieving enlightenment. What made the Harakiri girl competitions particularly intense was that their product couldn't be revised or improved after delivery. A tea ceremony could be repeated with adjustments, a martial arts lesson could be refined over time, but seppuku was definitively one time only. This meant that every ceremony was essentially a public examination of the practitioner's skills, with no opportunity for do-overs or gradual improvement based on feedback. The competitive pressure created rapid innovation within the industry. Practitioners developed increasingly sophisticated training methods, more refined ceremonial protocols, and more effective techniques for managing the psychological and emotional challenges of ritual death. Some innovations that emerged from this competition, particularly around anxiety management and dignity preservation, were so effective that they were quietly adopted by other ceremonial professions. But the pattern also revealed something darker about how market forces could intrude into even the most sacred aspects of human experience. The competition between schools sometimes prioritized professional reputation over client needs, leading to ceremonies that were more about showcasing the practitioner's skills than serving the person who was actually dying. This created a feedback loop where the most successful Harakiri girls were those who could balance authentic service to their clients with the need to maintain competitive advantage over their rivals. The best practitioners learned to make their innovations seem like ancient traditions. Their personal techniques appear to be universal truths, and their professional success look like natural spiritual authority. The effects of this professional competition were far-reaching and often unexpected. On the positive side, the rivalry between different schools drove rapid improvements in technique, training methods, and client care. The quality of seppuku ceremonies during the height of the style wars was reportedly higher than ever before, with participants better prepared and ceremonies more dignified than in previous generations. Who benefited most were the clients themselves. People facing ritual suicide had access to increasingly sophisticated preparation methods, more refined ceremonial options, and practitioners who were constantly improving their skills to stay competitive. The competition also created specialization, so clients could choose practitioners whose approaches matched their personal preferences and cultural backgrounds. The broader samurai class benefited indirectly as the improved quality of seppuku ceremonies enhanced the overall cultural prestige of ritual death. When ceremonies were executed flawlessly, they reinforced social beliefs about honor, courage, and proper behavior. Well-conducted seppuku became a source of inspiration and social cohesion rather than just a grim necessity. But the competitive pressures also created some problematic dynamics. Some practitioners began prioritizing innovation over tradition, leading to ceremonies that were technically impressive but culturally questionable. Others became so focused on outdoing their rivals that they lost sight of their clients' actual needs and preferences. The unintended consequences included the gradual commercialization of what was supposed to be a deeply spiritual experience. As competition intensified, some practitioners began marketing their services more aggressively, offering premium packages and exclusive techniques that turned ritual death into something approaching a luxury consumer experience. Perhaps most significantly, the professional rivalries began to influence broader cultural attitudes toward death and honor. The public awareness of different schools of seppuku made people more conscious of ceremony as performance, which sometimes undermined the spiritual authenticity that the ritual was supposed to represent. The long-term effects included the establishment of more formal training systems, the development of professional standards and certifications, and the creation of what amounted to a professional literature of death assistance techniques. By the late Edo period, there were actually written guides to Harakiri girl methodology, carefully disguised as general ceremonial manuals to maintain the fiction that such specialists didn't exist. This systematization helped preserve and transmit knowledge, but it also meant that what had begun as individual women finding creative solutions to social needs had evolved into an institutionalized industry with its own politics, hierarchies, and bureaucratic complications. Yet even as the style wars raged between competing schools of death assistants, a more dramatic crisis was developing that would challenge the entire profession's existence. Political changes in the broader society were beginning to question not just how people should die with honor, but whether ritual suicide should remain a central part of Japanese culture at all. Some progressive thinkers were arguing that a truly strong society shouldn't require its citizens to disembowel themselves over relatively minor social infractions. A few radical voices even suggested that the whole system of death-based honor was keeping Japan from developing more practical approaches to conflict resolution and social progress. These challenges would force the Harakiri girl community to confront questions that went far beyond professional rivalry and technique refinement. They would have to defend not just their methods, but the entire cultural foundation that made their profession necessary. And as we'll see, their response to this existential threat would reveal just how deeply they had become embedded in the social and political structures of feudal Japan. By the 1840s, the world of professional death assistants had reached a breaking point that nobody saw coming. The careful balance between official denial and practical necessity that had allowed Harakiri girls to operate for decades was about to collapse in the most spectacular way possible through what became known as the Great Seppuku Scandal, an incident so absurd and politically explosive that it nearly destroyed the entire profession overnight. The crisis began when Lord Matsudaira, one of the Tokugawa shogun's most trusted advisors, discovered that his teenage son had been secretly taking seppuku lessons from a Harakiri girl named Chiyo. This wasn't preparation for an actual ceremony. The boy had become fascinated with the ritual and was essentially treating it as a hobby, like modern teenagers might take up martial arts or music lessons. The problem was that Matsudaira discovered this information in the worst possible way. He walked in on his son practicing ceremonial disembowelment techniques with a wooden sword, while Chiyo provided detailed coaching on proper form, breathing techniques, and death poem composition. To make matters worse, several of the boy's friends were also present, and they had apparently been doing this for months as a kind of after-school activity. The key players involved in this disaster included not just Matsudaira and his son, but also Chiyo, who had somehow thought it was appropriate to teach ritual suicide to teenagers as a recreational activity, the boy's friends and their families, various government officials who had to figure out how to handle the situation, and eventually the entire Harakiri girl community, which found itself under unprecedented scrutiny for what was obviously a catastrophic lapse in professional judgment. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If word got out that Harakiri girls were teaching suicide techniques to children for entertainment, it would confirm every critic's worst fears about the profession and provide perfect ammunition for anyone who wanted to ban the practice entirely. The scandal threatened to expose the entire shadow economy of death assistants and force society to confront the contradictions it had been carefully ignoring for generations. The moment that changed everything happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the spring of 1844. Lord Matsudaira had returned home early from his duties at the shogun's court, looking forward to a quiet evening with his family. He decided to check on his son's studies, expecting to find the boy working on calligraphy or perhaps reading classical poetry, as befitted a young man of his station. Instead, he opened the door to find his 15-year-old son kneeling in formal position, wearing a white kimono with a wooden tanto in his hands, while a woman he didn't recognize was demonstrating the proper angle for blade insertion. "Remember," Chiyo was saying, "the goal is to cut from left to right in one smooth motion. Don't hesitate, don't saw back and forth, and try to maintain your composure, even if the pain is overwhelming." The boy nodded seriously and practiced the motion again, while three of his friends watched with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for important academic lessons. One of them was actually taking notes. Matsudaira stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity, trying to process what he was seeing. His first thought was that he had somehow stumbled into an actual suicide attempt, but the wooden sword and the casual atmosphere suggested something far more disturbing. His son was treating ritual disembowelment as a hobby. "Father," the boy exclaimed when he noticed Matsudaira in the doorway. "You're home early. Would you like to see what I've learned about proper seppuku technique? Chiyo-san has been teaching us the most fascinating things about ceremonial death traditions." Chiyo, displaying the kind of professional composure that had made her successful in the death assistance business, bowed formally and said, "Honorable Lord Matsudaira, I am pleased to meet you. Your son shows remarkable aptitude for ceremonial protocols. With proper training, he could execute a truly magnificent seppuku if the need ever arose." This was exactly the wrong thing to say. Matsudaira's shock transformed into the kind of cold fury that only comes from realizing that someone has been teaching your child how to kill himself efficiently. "You," he said in a voice that could have frozen sake, "have been teaching my son suicide techniques as recreational activities." Chiyo, suddenly realizing that perhaps she had misjudged the situation, attempted damage control. "Oh no, honored lord, this is educational instruction in traditional cultural practices." The young master was curious about proper ceremonial protocols, and I felt it was important for him to understand the correct procedures should he ever need to restore family honor through seppuku. "He is 15 years old," Matsudaira exploded, abandoning all pretense of aristocratic composure. "Why would he need to know how to commit suicide? What possible dishonor could a teenage boy bring upon our family that would require ritual death?" At this point, one of the other boys helpfully chimed in. "Actually, Lord Matsudaira, there are many scenarios where a young samurai might need to perform seppuku. Chio-san has been teaching us about historical cases involving young warriors who had to restore their honor after various mistakes. Just last week, we learned about a 16-year-old who committed suicide after accidentally stepping on his Lord Shadow. This was definitely not helping the situation." The confrontation escalated rapidly as Matsudaira demanded to know how long this had been going on, who else knew about it, and what exactly his son had been learning in these sessions. The answers were horrifying. The lessons had been continuing for 6 months. At least a dozen other families were involved, and the curriculum had included not just seppuku techniques, but also training in writing death poems, arranging ceremonial items, and even advanced topics like maintaining dignity during extreme pain and proper breathing techniques for prolonged disembowelment. Matsudaira's horror reached its peak when he realized that his son had been paying for these lessons with money from his monthly allowance, treating suicide instruction like music lessons or tutoring in mathematics. The boy had even received what amounted to progress reports detailing his improvement in various aspects of ceremonial death preparation. "Father," his son said, apparently still not grasping the seriousness of the situation, "would you like to see my death poem? Chio-san says it shows real promise for capturing the ephemeral nature of earthly existence." That was the moment when Lord Matsudaira realized that this scandal was going to destroy not just his family's reputation, but potentially bring down the entire carefully maintained fiction that allowed Harakiri girls to operate in Japanese society. If word got out that these women were running what amounted to suicide schools for teenagers, the backlash would be swift and devastating. The response was immediate and catastrophic for everyone involved. Matsudaira's first action was to summon the parents of all the other boys involved, leading to a series of increasingly hysterical family meetings as each household discovered that their children had been spending their free time learning how to commit ritual suicide with professional instruction. The reactions ranged from outrage to bewilderment to horrified fascination. Some parents were furious that their sons had been exposed to what they considered premature and inappropriate instruction in adult ceremonies. Others were secretly impressed by the quality of education their children had received, noting that the boys had learned more about traditional culture and ceremonial protocols in 6 months than they typically absorbed in years of formal schooling. One father reportedly said, "I'm appalled that my son was learning suicide techniques without my permission, but I have to admit, his death poem is really quite sophisticated for a 14-year-old. The immediate consequences were swift and far-reaching. Chio was banned from operating within Edo's jurisdiction, though she reportedly continued her practice in rural areas under an assumed name. The boys were forbidden from any further contact with Harakiri girls and were enrolled in extra calligraphy and poetry classes to redirect their interest in traditional culture toward less lethal pursuits. But the political fallout was much more serious. Word of the scandal inevitably leaked beyond the families involved, and within weeks rumors were spreading throughout Edo's social networks about professional death instructors corrupting innocent children with suicide education. The stories grew more dramatic with each retelling. By some accounts, there were secret schools throughout the city where children as young as 10 were learning advanced disembowelment techniques. Government officials found themselves in an impossible position. They couldn't officially investigate an industry that didn't officially exist, but they also couldn't ignore growing public concern about children receiving professional suicide instruction. Some officials quietly tried to issue warnings to known Harakiri girls about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. while others argued for formal regulations that would require acknowledging the profession's existence. The Harakiri girl community was thrown into crisis. Professional associations held emergency meetings to discuss damage control strategies, while individual practitioners faced scrutiny from their local communities. Some regions saw vigilante groups forming to protect children from suicide instructors, leading to harassment and occasional violence against women suspected of being Harakiri girls. The broader cultural consequences were even more significant. The scandal forced Japanese society to confront the contradictions in their attitude toward ritual death. If seppuku was truly a noble expression of inner honor, why was everyone so horrified by the idea of children learning about it? If the ceremonies were sacred traditions worthy of preservation, why did professional instruction seem so unseemly? Religious authorities, who had long maintained an uneasy relationship with the practice of ritual suicide, seized on the scandal as evidence that the entire system had become corrupted by commercialization and professionalization. Some Buddhist leaders argued that the incident proved seppuku had devolved from spiritual practice into mere performance art. The scandal also revealed just how embedded Harakiri girls had become in Japanese society. As investigations continued, officials discovered that the profession was far more widespread and sophisticated than anyone had realized, with training schools, professional networks, and economic relationships that extended throughout the country. This incident wasn't just an embarrassing scandal involving poor judgment and inappropriate education. It was a watershed moment that forced Japanese society to examine the fundamental contradictions in their approach to honor, death, and cultural tradition. The Great Seppuku Scandal revealed that the careful balance between official denial and practical acceptance that had allowed the Harakiri girl profession to flourish was inherently unstable and ultimately unsustainable. What the scandal revealed about the system was deeply unsettling to many observers. If ritual suicide was truly a spontaneous expression of inner honor and spiritual resolve, then the existence of professional coaches, standardized techniques, and educational curricula suggested that the entire practice had become artificial and performative. The idea that someone could take lessons in dying honorably implied that honor itself could be taught, purchased, and packaged, a concept that undermined the philosophical foundations of the samurai worldview. The incident also exposed the extent to which Japanese society had become dependent on professional death assistance, while maintaining the fiction that such help was unnecessary. The discovery that even children were seeking out this instruction suggested that the cultural pressure to understand proper suicide protocols had become so intense that young people felt compelled to prepare for scenarios they hoped never to face. Long-term effects of the scandal included increased scrutiny of all ceremonial professions, growing debate about the role of tradition versus innovation in Japanese culture, and the beginning of more systematic criticism of the entire system of honor-based suicide. Some progressive thinkers use the incident as evidence that Japan needed to modernize its approach to conflict resolution and social discipline. But perhaps most significantly, the scandal marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of Harakiri girls. The profession would continue to exist, but never again with the same level of social acceptance and professional autonomy. The women who had built successful careers helping others die with dignity found themselves increasingly marginalized and stigmatized, victims of a cultural shift they had inadvertently triggered by being too successful at their impossible job. Around the main drama of professional death assistance and political scandals, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that reveal just how complex and interconnected this shadow industry had become. These weren't just random people who happened to get caught up in the Harakiri girl phenomenon. They were essential players who helped create, sustain, and ultimately transform the entire system. Meet Kenji the Blade Merchant, who discovered that supplying ceremonial weapons to Harakiri girls was significantly more profitable than his regular samurai clientele. Kenji wasn't just selling swords, he was essentially running a specialized medical supply business for the death industry. He developed shorter, sharper tantos specifically designed for ritual suicide, with handles that provided better grip for nervous participants and blades that could cut cleanly through silk clothing without snagging. His workshop became a gathering place where Harakiri girls would discuss technical challenges, share client stories, and debate the merits of different blade styles for various types of ceremonies. But Kenji's story gets really interesting when you realize that he was also supplying weapons to both sides of the style wars. He would sell elegant, artistically decorated blades to Tomo's elegance school, while simultaneously providing plain, functional weapons to Yuki's efficiency movement. Each school believed they had an exclusive relationship with the best blade supplier in Edo, never realizing that Kenji was playing both sides and getting rich off their professional rivalry. He reportedly told friends that death makes everyone equal, but the tools of death are surprisingly good for business. Then there's Grandmother Masa, a retired geisha, who became the unofficial training supervisor for new Harakiri girls entering the profession. Masa had never actually assisted with a seppuku ceremony herself, but she understood performance, psychology, and the art of managing difficult social situations better than anyone in Japan. She ran what amounted to a finishing school for death assistants, teaching young women how to project calm authority, read emotional cues from distressed clients, and navigate the complex social dynamics of families preparing for ritual suicide. Masa's curriculum was reportedly more comprehensive than most formal education programs. Students learned voice modulation techniques for delivering soothing instructions during high-stress situations, posture and movement training to maintain graceful composure in cramped spaces, and advanced psychology focused on helping people overcome their natural survival instincts. She even taught business skills, contract negotiation, reputation management, and what she called difficult family dynamics for dealing with relatives who might blame the Harakiri girl if anything went wrong during a ceremony. Perhaps most remarkably, Masa represented something that was almost unknown in feudal Japan, an older woman with significant economic and social power who had built her authority entirely through her own expertise rather than through marriage or family connections. She employed dozens of women, influenced major business decisions throughout the death assistance industry, and was consulted by government officials who officially denied that her profession existed. Dr. Watanabe was another crucial figure, a physician who specialized in what he euphemistically called ceremonial medicine. In theory, doctors weren't supposed to be involved in suicide assistance, since their job was to preserve life rather than end it. In practice, Watanabe had discovered that there was significant demand for medical expertise in ensuring that seppuku ceremonies went smoothly and participants didn't suffer unnecessarily. Watanabe developed what he called dignity preservation protocols, medical techniques for helping people maintain composure and consciousness during ritual disembowelment. He created special herbal preparations that could reduce pain without eliminating awareness, positioning techniques that minimized blood flow to extend the ceremony's duration, and even emergency intervention methods for cases where participants lost their nerve halfway through and needed to be assisted in completing their commitment. The most fascinating aspect of Watanabe's work was that he somehow managed to maintain his reputation as a legitimate physician while running what will essentially a side business in medical assistance for suicide. He published papers on traditional ceremonial health practices that were actually detailed analyses of optimal techniques for ritual death, carefully disguised as academic research into cultural traditions. These weren't isolated individuals. Operating independently, they formed complex webs of relationships that revealed just how integrated the death assistance industry had become with broader Japanese society. The connections between these supporting players created a shadow economy that paralleled and sometimes intersected with the official social structure in ways that would have horrified government officials if they had fully understood what was happening. Consider how Kenji the Blade Merchant's business connected to Grandmother Masa's training programs. Masa would send her advanced students to Kenji's workshop, not just to learn about weapon selection, but to understand the psychology of men who were preparing to die. Kenji had discovered that clients shopping for suicide weapons revealed their deepest fears and anxieties during the selection process, providing valuable insights that Masa's students could use to better serve their future clients. This created a feedback loop where blade merchants were essentially serving as informal psychological counselors, while Harakiri girls were becoming amateur experts in metallurgy and weapon design. The boundary between different professions began to blur as everyone in the industry realized that their success depended on understanding every aspect of the ritual death process. Dr. Watanabe's medical practice became the unofficial research and development center for the entire industry. Harakiri girls would bring him questions about client health issues, unusual medical complications they had observed during ceremonies, and requests for new techniques to handle challenging situations. In return, Watanabe would test new approaches with volunteer clients and share his findings throughout the professional network. One particularly revealing example involved a collaboration between all three supporting characters to handle what became known as the merchant's dilemma. A wealthy silk trader needed to commit seppuku to restore his family's honor, but he had a medical condition that made traditional disembowelment potentially fatal before he could complete the proper ceremonial elements. This created a professional challenge that required expertise from multiple specialists. Grandmother Masa provided a specially trained Harakiri girl who understood the unique requirements of working with clients who had specific medical limitations. Kenji designed a custom blade that could accommodate the trader's physical constraints while maintaining ceremonial appropriateness. Dr. Watanabe developed a medical protocol that would allow the ceremony to proceed safely while ensuring the client could complete all necessary ritual elements before succumbing to his injuries. The collaboration was so successful that it established a new standard of care for clients with special medical needs, leading to the development of what amounted to a specialized medical subspecialty focused on ritual death assistance. This innovation then spread throughout the industry, improving the quality of care for all clients and establishing new professional relationships between different types of specialists. But these interconnections also created vulnerabilities. When the Great Seppuku scandal broke, investigators discovered that the network of supporting businesses was far more extensive than anyone had realized. Kenji's sales records revealed the true scope of the industry. Masa's training programs had documented evidence of systematic instruction in suicide assistance, and Dr. Watanabe's medical records contained detailed analyses of hundreds of seppuku cases. The political implications were staggering. Government officials realized that what they had thought was a small cottage industry of individual women helping with occasional ceremonies was actually a sophisticated professional network with supply chains, training institutions, research and development programs and quality control systems that rivaled legitimate industries. Even more disturbing was the discovery that this shadow economy had become financially significant enough to influence broader markets. Kenji's blade business employed dozens of craftsmen, Masa's training program supported hundreds of women, and Dr. Watanabe's medical practice generated enough revenue to fund ongoing research into ceremonial health optimization. To understand how these supporting characters could build such successful careers around death assistance, you have to understand the broader cultural context that made their services not just tolerable, but essential. Daily life in Edo period Japan was structured around concepts of honor, shame, and social obligation that created constant pressure for perfect behavior and severe consequences for even minor failures. This wasn't a society where you could easily recover from mistakes or social missteps. If you embarrassed your family, disrespected your superiors, or failed to meet social expectations, the cultural response was often disproportionately severe by modern standards. People lived with the constant awareness that a single bad decision could result in complete social ostracism or demands for ritual suicide to restore family honor. What was normal in this context was the idea that death could be preferable to dishonor, that suicide could be a rational response to social problems, and that there were correct and incorrect ways to die that could affect your family's reputation for generations. What was exceptional was the development of a professional support system to help people navigate these cultural expectations more successfully. The beliefs and attitudes that shaped daily life included the concept that individual identity was inseparable from family and social group identity, that personal honor was a finite resource that could be depleted through poor choices, and that death could serve as a form of communication that conveyed messages about character, commitment, and cultural values. Social structures reinforce these beliefs through systems of collective responsibility. where entire families or communities could be held accountable for individual members' behavior. This created enormous pressure for conformity and proper behavior, but also established the social conditions where professional assistance with ritual suicide could be seen as a legitimate service rather than a morbid business opportunity. The supporting characters succeeded because they understood that their clients weren't just buying death assistance, they were purchasing social insurance, reputation management, and cultural navigation services. Kenji wasn't just selling swords. He was providing tools that could help families restore their social standing. Masa wasn't just training women to assist with suicides, she was educating specialists in crisis management and family counseling. Dr. Watanabe wasn't just providing medical support for dying people, he was offering expertise in maintaining dignity during the most challenging circumstances imaginable. This cultural context explains why these businesses could operate openly while being officially invisible, why they could attract high-quality personnel and significant investment, and why they could develop sophisticated professional standards in an industry that was supposedly just individual women helping out during family emergencies. Perhaps most ironic was the fact that an industry dedicated to helping people die was actually one of the most life-affirming sectors of the Japanese economy. The Harakiri girls and their supporting network created opportunities for women to develop professional skills, earn independent incomes, and exercise social authority in ways that were almost impossible in other areas of feudal society. The contradictions were everywhere you looked. Dr. Watanabe took an oath to preserve life but built his most successful practice around helping people die more effectively. Kenji created beautiful, artistic weapons designed specifically for self-destruction, turning instruments of death into objects of aesthetic appreciation. Grandmother Masa used her expertise in entertainment and performance to train women for the most serious and solemn profession imaginable. Even more contradictory was the way the death assistance industry actually promoted life by making it easier for people to fulfill their social obligations without actually dying unnecessarily. Many clients who worked with Harakiri girls reportedly found that the preparation process helped them resolve their underlying problems or find alternative solutions to their social difficulties, reducing the actual number of suicides while maintaining the cultural fiction that ritual death remained a viable option. The supporting characters embodied these contradictions in their daily lives. They were simultaneously essential and invisible, wealthy and socially marginal, respected for their expertise and shunned for their profession. They operated businesses that everyone knew about but no one could officially acknowledge, serving clients who needed their services but couldn't admit to using them. Modern parallels to these contradictions might include industries like private military contractors, addiction treatment centers, or divorce mediation services. Professions that serve essential social functions while dealing with subjects that make people uncomfortable and create complex ethical questions about the relationship between individual needs and social expectations. The ultimate irony was that the supporting characters who helped create and sustain the Harakiri girl industry were often more socially progressive and economically innovative than the mainstream society they served, despite being involved in what was supposedly the most traditional and conservative of cultural practices. Everything changed when Commodore Perry's black ships appeared in Tokyo Bay in 1853, but not in the way most history books tell the story. While everyone focuses on how American gunboat diplomacy forced Japan to open its borders to foreign trade, the real transformation for the Harakiri girl industry came from something much more subtle and ultimately more devastating: the introduction of Western ideas about mental health, individual rights, and the value of human life. The turning point wasn't a single dramatic moment, but rather a gradual shift in cultural attitudes that began when Japanese intellectuals started reading Western books about psychology, medicine, and social organization. These texts introduced concepts that were fundamentally incompatible with the cultural foundations that had made the death assistance industry possible in the first place. Western psychology suggested that the desire to commit suicide was a symptom of mental illness rather than a rational response to social problems. Western medicine emphasized the preservation of life as the highest medical priority, making Dr. Watanabe's ceremonial medicine seem barbaric rather than innovative. Western philosophy promoted individual rights and personal autonomy in ways that challenged the collective responsibility systems that had created the social pressures requiring ritual suicide. But the most significant factor in this cultural shift was the realization that other advanced civilizations had developed sophisticated approaches to honor, social order, and conflict resolution that didn't require anyone to disembowel themselves. Japanese observers studying Western societies discovered that it was possible to have stable social hierarchies, effective governance, and cultural traditions without institutionalizing suicide as a solution to social problems. This wasn't just an intellectual revelation, it was a practical recognition that Japan's approach to honor and social discipline might actually be holding the country back from achieving the kind of technological and economic progress that had made Western nations so powerful. If Japan wanted to compete in the modern world, it might need to stop encouraging its most talented citizens to kill themselves over relatively minor social infractions. The background to this change included growing awareness among Japanese leaders that the country's traditional approaches to social organization were not well suited to the challenges of industrialization, international diplomacy, and technological innovation. The samurai class, which had provided the cultural framework for the entire honor-based suicide system, was beginning to seem less like an essential social institution and more like an expensive anachronism. Why this moment was different from previous periods of cultural change was the combination of external pressure and internal recognition that fundamental transformation was necessary for national survival. Previous challenges to the seppuku system had been philosophical or religious in nature, but the modernization crisis represented an existential threat to Japan's independence and prosperity. Key factors that led to transformation included the influence of Western education, the practical requirements of modern governance and diplomacy, the economic costs of losing productive citizens to ritual suicide, and the growing recognition that other successful societies had found better ways to maintain social order. The transformation didn't happen overnight, and it definitely didn't happen smoothly. The process of cultural change unfolded through a series of conflicts, negotiations, and gradual shifts that revealed just how deeply embedded the death assistance industry had become in Japanese society, and how difficult it would be to replace the social functions it served. Resistance to change came from multiple directions and for complex reasons that went far beyond simple traditionalism. The samurai class fought against modernization partly because their entire social identity was built around concepts of honor and death that made harakiri girls necessary. Government officials resisted change because the ritual suicide system provided an effective method for dealing with corruption, incompetence, and social disorder without requiring expensive legal proceedings or long-term imprisonment. But perhaps most surprisingly, some of the strongest resistance came from the harakiri girls themselves and their supporting network. These women had built successful businesses and achieved social status that was almost unprecedented for women in feudal Japan. The prospect of modernization threatened to eliminate not just their profession, but their economic independence and social authority. Grandmother Masa reportedly organized what amounted to the first professional women's association in Japanese history, bringing together harakiri girls, blade merchants, ceremonial suppliers, and other death industry professionals to coordinate resistance to the cultural changes that threatened their livelihoods. Their argument was that ritual suicide served essential social functions that modernization couldn't replace, and that eliminating the practice would create more problems than it solved. The champions of change included progressive intellectuals who had studied Western approaches to social organization, government officials who recognized that ritual suicide was incompatible with modern administrative systems, and younger samurai who wanted to redirect their warrior traditions toward more productive purposes like military modernization and industrial development. The most effective advocate for change turned out to be Dr. Watanabe, whose medical background gave him unique credibility in arguing that the ritual suicide system was actually harmful to public health and social progress. He published a series of papers demonstrating that the psychological pressure to commit suicide over minor social infractions was creating widespread mental health problems, reducing productivity, and preventing the kind of risk-taking and innovation that modern societies required. Watanabe's breakthrough insight was that the same medical and psychological techniques he had developed to help people die more effectively could be adapted to help people live more successfully. He began offering what he called honor preservation therapy, counseling and support services that helped people resolve social conflicts and restore their reputations without requiring suicide. The specific steps of transformation involved gradual changes to legal codes, educational systems, and social expectations rather than dramatic policy announcements. The government began quietly discouraging ritual suicide by offering alternative ways for people to restore their honor through public service, financial restitution, or temporary exile rather than death. Educational reforms introduced Western concepts of individual psychology and social problem solving that provided people with mental frameworks for understanding their difficulties in ways that didn't automatically lead to suicide as the preferred solution. New legal procedures created formal mechanisms for resolving disputes and addressing social infractions through courts and administrative processes rather than through honor-based violence. Obstacles encountered during this transformation included fierce resistance from traditionalists who viewed any change as cultural betrayal, practical difficulties in replacing social functions that ritual suicide had served, and the challenge of helping people develop new approaches to dealing with shame, dishonor, and social conflict. The breakthrough moments came when progressive leaders began demonstrating that Western approaches to social organization could actually strengthen rather than weaken Japanese culture. The key insight was that eliminating ritual suicide didn't mean abandoning concepts of honor and social responsibility. It meant finding more effective ways to uphold these values through constructive action rather than self-destruction. One pivotal event occurred when a group of young samurai who had been studying Western military techniques proposed redirecting warrior traditions toward national defense and technological development rather than individual death rituals. Their argument was that true honor lay in using one's skills and courage to strengthen Japan's position in the world rather than in demonstrating personal virtue through suicide. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in driving this change was complex and often contradictory. While specific leaders and intellectuals played crucial roles in promoting modernization, the broader transformation was driven by external pressures and practical necessities that would have eventually forced change regardless of individual preferences. The new system that emerged from this cultural transformation was dramatically different from what had come before, though it retained more elements of traditional Japanese culture than either the modernizers or traditionalists had expected. The era of professional death assistance was ending, but it wasn't being replaced by Western individualism so much as by new forms of collective responsibility and social organization. The most obvious change was that ritual suicide stopped being an expected response to social problems and became increasingly rare and socially disapproved. Government officials who made mistakes were expected to resign, apologize publicly, and accept reassignment to less prestigious positions rather than commit seppuku. Merchants who violated business ethics faced financial penalties and social exclusion rather than demands for ritual death. But the deeper transformation involved the development of new social institutions that could serve the same functions that ritual suicide had provided without requiring anyone to actually die. Honor courts were established to adjudicate disputes about reputation and social standing. Public service programs allowed people to restore their social status through constructive work rather than self-destruction. Educational reforms taught conflict resolution and emotional regulation skills that helped people handle shame and social pressure more effectively. Who won and who lost in this transformation was more complicated than you might expect. The obvious losers were the Harakiri girls and their supporting network, who found their profession becoming not just unnecessary, but actively discouraged by government policy and social pressure. Many of these women had to completely reinvent their careers, though some successfully transitioned into related fields like counseling, ceremony coordination, and traditional arts education. The winners included people who had previously lived under constant fear of making social mistakes that could require suicide, families who no longer had to worry about losing members to ritual death, and Japanese society as a whole which could redirect human resources toward productive activities rather than dramatic self-destruction. But the situation was more nuanced than simple winners and losers. Some aspects of the old system had actually served important social functions that the new institutions struggled to replace effectively. Ritual suicide had provided a clear mechanism for accountability and moral restoration that was sometimes more effective than the bureaucratic alternatives that replaced it. The new rules and norms included legal prohibitions against encouraging or assisting suicide, social expectations that problems should be resolved through dialogue and compromise rather than dramatic gestures, and cultural values that emphasized rehabilitation and second chances rather than permanent shame and exclusion. What stayed the same was surprising in its extent. Japanese society retained its emphasis on collective responsibility, social harmony, and the importance of maintaining proper relationships with family and community. The concepts of honor, duty, and social obligation remained central to Japanese culture, but they were redirected toward constructive purposes rather than self-destructive ones. What changed dramatically was the elimination of death as an acceptable solution to social problems, the development of more flexible approaches to shame and reputation management, and the creation of institutional mechanisms for conflict resolution that didn't require extreme personal sacrifice. The transition wasn't entirely smooth or complete. Some regions continued to see occasional ritual suicides well into the modern era, and the cultural pressures that had made the practice seem necessary didn't disappear overnight. But the social infrastructure that had supported the Harakiri girl industry was systematically dismantled and replaced with institutions that served similar functions without the deadly consequences. Was this change positive or negative? The answer depends entirely on what you value and how you measure social progress, but the transformation was undoubtedly one of the most significant cultural shifts in Japanese history. From a humanitarian perspective, the elimination of institutionalized suicide was clearly beneficial. Hundreds of lives were saved each year, families were preserved intact, and Japanese society stopped losing talented individuals to social mistakes that could have been resolved through less dramatic means. The psychological burden of living under constant threat of required suicide was lifted from an entire generation of Japanese people. From a modernization perspective, the change was essential for Japan's successful transition to a modern industrial society. Countries that encourage their citizens to commit suicide over minor social infractions are not well positioned to compete in international markets, engage in complex diplomacy, or adapt to rapid technological change. The elimination of ritual suicide was a prerequisite for Japan's later economic and political success. But from a cultural preservation perspective, the transformation involved significant losses that some observers considered tragic. The ritual suicide system had been deeply connected to broader concepts of honor, duty, and spiritual development that were central to traditional Japanese identity. Eliminating seppuku meant abandoning cultural practices that had shaped Japanese society for centuries and replacing them with foreign concepts that might not be as well suited to Japanese values and social structures. Different perspectives on the change reflected different priorities and worldviews. Progressive intellectuals saw it as liberation from barbaric traditions that had held Japan back from achieving its full potential. Traditional conservatives viewed it as cultural betrayal that undermined the spiritual foundations of Japanese civilization. Pragmatic government officials considered it a necessary adaptation to changing circumstances that would strengthen Japan's position in the world. The short-term effects included social disruption as people adapted to new expectations and institutions, economic dislocation for people whose livelihoods had depended on the death industry, and cultural confusion as traditional approaches to honor and shame were replaced with unfamiliar alternatives. Long-term effects proved more positive as Japan successfully modernized while retaining core cultural values, developed more effective approaches to social organization and conflict resolution, and eliminated a source of unnecessary suffering and social waste. Unintended consequences included the loss of some traditional arts and cultural knowledge, the weakening of certain forms of social accountability, and the gradual erosion of some aspects of Japanese cultural identity that had been connected to the ritual suicide system. Modern judgment tends to view the elimination of institutionalized suicide as obviously beneficial, while contemporary views were much more mixed and often conflicted. The people who lived through this transformation understood both what was being gained and what was being lost in ways that later generations might not fully appreciate. In the years and decades that followed the modernization crisis, the former Harakiri girls and their supporting network faced the challenge of reinventing themselves in a society that no longer needed their specialized services. What happened to these women reveals as much about their resourcefulness and adaptability as their original profession had revealed about their entrepreneurial skills and cultural insight. Many former Harakiri girls discovered that their expertise in managing high-stress situations, counseling people through emotional crises, and coordinating complex ceremonies translated surprisingly well to other professions. Some became matchmakers using their skills in reading human psychology and managing family dynamics to help arrange marriages. Others transitioned into roles as funeral directors, applying their knowledge of ceremonial protocols and grief counseling to help families navigate death in more conventional ways. Perhaps most remarkably, several former Harakiri girls became pioneers in what would eventually be recognized as professional counseling and social work. Their experience in helping people cope with shame, restore their social standing, and find dignity in difficult circumstances proved invaluable in the new social institutions that were being developed to replace the old, honor-based suicide system. Grandmother Masa, who had run the training programs for Harakiri girls, established what was probably Japan's first professional school for women in social services. Her curriculum combined traditional Japanese concepts of social harmony with Western approaches to psychology and conflict resolution, creating a hybrid educational model that influenced the development of modern Japanese social work. Dr. Watanabe transformed his ceremonial medicine practice into a pioneering mental health clinic, becoming one of the first Japanese physicians to specialize in what we would now call psychiatry and psychological counseling. His techniques for helping people maintain dignity under extreme stress evolved into therapeutic approaches that were decades ahead of their time. But the transition wasn't smooth or universally successful. Some former Harakiri girls struggled to find new roles that provided the same level of income, social respect, and professional autonomy they had enjoyed in their original profession. A few reportedly continued to practice in secret, serving clients who preferred traditional approaches to honor and social problem solving, despite the cultural changes taking place around them. The new challenges that emerged included social stigma associated with their former profession, difficulty gaining recognition for their skills in legitimate professional contexts, and the psychological adjustment required to shift from helping people die with dignity to helping them live more successfully. Some women found that potential employers and clients were uncomfortable with their backgrounds in death assistance, even when their skills were obviously relevant to new roles. Second-generation effects included the influence these women had on the broader development of social services, counseling, and women's professional opportunities in modernizing Japan. Their daughters and students often became leaders in education, social reform, and women's rights movements, carrying forward the independence and professional competence that had characterized the Harakiri girl community. The evolution of the situation also revealed how deeply the death assistance industry had shaped Japanese approaches to crisis management, ceremonial organization, and psychological support. Many of the innovations that had emerged from the competitive environment of the Harakiri girl profession became standard practices in other fields, though their origins were rarely acknowledged or remembered. Perhaps most significantly, the aftermath demonstrated that the skills and knowledge developed in the death assistance industry had been far more transferable and socially valuable than anyone had realized. The women who had been marginalized as practitioners of a barbaric profession proved to be pioneers in fields that became essential to modern Japanese society. As the traditional Harakiri girl profession declined, new players emerged who represented different approaches to the social functions that ritual suicide had served. These weren't direct replacements for the death assistance industry, but rather new types of professionals who addressed the underlying social needs that had made Harakiri girls necessary in the first place. The most important new figures were the honor mediators, professional negotiators who specialized in resolving disputes about reputation, social standing, and family honor without requiring anyone to commit suicide. These mediators combined legal knowledge, psychological insight, and deep understanding of traditional Japanese concepts of honor to help people find face-saving solutions to social conflicts. Unlike the Harakiri girls who had worked primarily with individuals preparing for death, the honor mediators worked with entire families and communities to address the social dynamics that created pressure for ritual suicide. They developed techniques for public apology, symbolic restitution, and reputation rehabilitation that allowed people to restore their social standing through constructive action rather than self-destruction. One of the most successful honor mediators was a former samurai named Takeshi, who had been trained in Western legal procedures but retained deep respect for traditional Japanese values. Takeshi's innovation was the development of honor courts, formal but flexible procedures that allowed communities to address social infractions through dialogue, mediation, and negotiated settlements rather than through honor-based violence. These honor courts became incredibly popular because they provided many of the social functions that ritual suicide had served: public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, community involvement in moral restoration, and clear procedures for reintegrating offenders into social groups without requiring anyone to actually die. Takeshi's success led to the establishment of similar institutions throughout Japan, creating what amounted to a new profession of social harmony specialists. Another category of new players were the dignity coaches, professionals who helped people develop the psychological and social skills needed to navigate modern Japanese society without the traditional safety valve of ritual suicide. These coaches worked with individuals who were struggling with shame, social anxiety, or family pressure, teaching them alternative approaches to maintaining honor and social standing. The dignity coaches differed from earlier Harakiri girls in that their goal was to help people avoid situations that might traditionally have required suicide, rather than helping them die more effectively once such situations arose. They focused on conflict prevention, reputation management, and emotional regulation rather than ceremonial preparation and death assistance. Some dignity coaches were former Harakiri girls who had successfully transitioned to life-affirming practices, while others were educated professionals who had studied Western psychology and adapted it to Japanese cultural contexts. Their contribution to society was the development of practical alternatives to the honor-based suicide system that preserved important cultural values while eliminating the deadly consequences. A third group of new players were the tradition preservationists, scholars, artists, and cultural specialists who worked to maintain knowledge of traditional Japanese ceremonial practices while adapting them for modern contexts. These individuals recognized that the elimination of ritual suicide threatened to destroy valuable cultural knowledge about ceremony, aesthetics, and spiritual practice that had broader applications beyond death assistance. The tradition preservationists differed from both earlier and contemporary professionals in that they approached traditional practices as cultural heritage rather than practical necessities. They established schools, museums, and research institutions dedicated to preserving knowledge of traditional Japanese ceremony while explicitly rejecting the deadly applications that had made such knowledge socially problematic. Their work helped ensure that the cultural innovations developed by Harakiri girls, particularly their advances in ceremonial aesthetics, psychological preparation, and crisis management, weren't completely lost when the profession itself became obsolete. Instead, these innovations were preserved, studied, and adapted for peaceful applications in modern Japanese society, but some problems persisted that proved remarkably resistant to the cultural changes that had eliminated the Harakiri girl profession. The underlying social dynamics that had created demand for ritual suicide, particularly the intense pressure for social conformity, the fear of bringing shame upon one's family, and the difficulty of recovering from public mistakes, didn't disappear just because seppuku was no longer culturally acceptable. Instead, these continuing challenges manifested in new forms that were sometimes more subtle but equally destructive. Social ostracism replaced ritual suicide as the primary consequence for serious social infractions, but ostracism could be just as devastating to individuals and families as death had been. People who would previously have committed seppuku to restore their family's honor now faced decades of social isolation and economic exclusion. The new versions of old problems included what modern observers might recognize as social anxiety, disorders, depression, and other mental health issues that emerged when people internalized the shame and social pressure that had previously been resolved through ritual death. Without the option of dramatic self-sacrifice to restore honor, some individuals became trapped in cycles of psychological self-punishment that were arguably more cruel than the traditional system had been. Some communities developed informal mechanisms for social exclusion that were almost as final as death, but without the dignity and closure that ritual suicide had provided. Families could find themselves permanently marginalized from social and economic opportunities, creating generational cycles of shame and disadvantage that the traditional honor system had been designed to prevent. Cyclical patterns emerged where periods of social liberalization alternated with conservative backlash against Western influences and demands for return to traditional values. During these conservative periods, there were occasionally attempts to revive elements of the old honor-based suicide system, though these efforts never gained widespread social acceptance. Why certain issues proved intractable was largely because they were rooted in fundamental aspects of Japanese social organization that were much deeper than the specific practice of ritual suicide. The collectivist orientation that made individual honor inseparable from family and community honor couldn't be easily changed through policy reforms or cultural modernization. The psychological mechanisms that made shame and social disapproval so powerful in Japanese society were connected to child-rearing practices, educational systems, and social structures that predated the samurai era and continued to influence behavior long after the formal elimination of the honor-based suicide system. Even more problematic was the fact that some of the social functions served by ritual suicide had been genuinely valuable, and the modern alternatives didn't always work as effectively. The traditional system had provided clear procedures for accountability, moral restoration, and community healing that were sometimes more effective than the bureaucratic processes that replaced them. Modern Japanese society continued to struggle with high rates of suicide, though for different reasons and through different mechanisms than had characterized the traditional honor-based system. The elimination of ritual seppuku didn't eliminate the underlying cultural factors that made death seem preferable to social failure, and some observers argued that the modern approach to these issues was actually less honest and effective than the traditional system had been. The persistence of these fundamental social dynamics meant that while the specific profession of Harakiri girls had become obsolete, the need for specialists in managing shame, social pressure, and honor-related conflicts remained as strong as ever. The difference was that these needs were now being addressed through institutions and professions that were officially recognized and socially acceptable, rather than through shadow industries that operated in cultural gray areas. Compared to earlier periods in Japanese history, the post-modernization era represented a fundamental shift in how society balanced individual welfare against collective harmony. But the basic tension between these competing values remained unresolved. The elimination of ritual suicide had solved the immediate problem of unnecessary death, but it hadn't addressed the underlying social dynamics that had made such extreme measures seem necessary in the first place. What was unique about the Harakiri girl era was the development of a professional industry dedicated to managing the intersection between individual crisis and social expectations. No other period in Japanese history had seen such systematic and sophisticated approaches to helping people navigate the cultural pressures that could lead to self-destruction. What was universal about the challenges they addressed was the fundamental human struggle to maintain dignity and social connection in the face of failure, shame, and social disapproval. Every society has to develop mechanisms for dealing with these issues, and the Japanese approach, while extreme in its embrace of ritual suicide, was actually more honest and systematic than many alternatives. Lessons that could be learned from the Harakiri girl phenomenon included the importance of providing people with clear pathways for moral restoration and social reintegration after serious mistakes. The value of professional expertise in managing psychological and social crises, and the need for cultural institutions that can help people maintain dignity during their most vulnerable moments. The patterns that repeated elsewhere included the tendency for societies under pressure to develop extreme responses to social problems, the emergence of shadow industries to serve needs that official institutions can't acknowledge, and the resistance that established professions show to social changes that threaten their existence. Modern societies dealing with high suicide rates, social media shaming, cancel culture, and other forms of social ostracism might find relevant insights in how Japanese society managed similar dynamics during the Edo period. The Harakiri girl approach of providing professional support for people facing social crisis while maintaining community involvement in moral restoration offers potential models for contemporary social problems. Comparative analysis with other cultures revealed that Japan's approach to honor-based suicide was unusual in its systematization and professionalization, but not unique in its basic recognition that social death and physical death were closely related phenomena that required community management. The most significant lesson from the comparative perspective was that social problems requiring extreme solutions usually indicate deeper structural issues that can't be resolved simply by eliminating the extreme behaviors. Japan's successful transition away from ritual suicide required not just cultural change but fundamental reforms in legal systems, educational approaches, and social institutions that addressed the root causes of honor-based social pressure. The ultimate insight from comparing different historical periods was that the Harakiri girl profession had served functions that were essential to social stability and individual welfare, and that eliminating the profession without replacing those functions would have created more problems than it solved. The success of Japanese modernization depended as much on developing effective alternatives to ritual suicide as on eliminating the practice itself. By the 1870s, signs pointed unmistakably toward the end of the Harakiri girl profession, though the women involved were among the last to recognize that their era was ending. The warning signs had been accumulating for decades, but they were subtle enough that practitioners could rationalize them as temporary setbacks rather than permanent cultural shifts. The most obvious indicator was the dramatic decline in demand for their services. Families that would previously have hired Harakiri girls for ritual suicide ceremonies were increasingly seeking alternative solutions to honor-related problems. Government officials who had once routinely committed seppuku after policy failures were now expected to resign quietly and accept reassignment to less prestigious positions. But the more telling sign was the change in the type of clients who did still seek their services. The sophisticated urban samurai who had been their primary clientele were being replaced by rural traditionalists and older individuals who clung to the old ways despite changing social expectations. These clients were often less wealthy, less socially influential, and less able to provide the kind of prestigious referrals that had sustained the profession's growth. What key players could see versus what they missed revealed the complex psychology of professionals facing the obsolescence of their entire industry. Grandmother Masa, the training supervisor, recognized early that fundamental changes were underway and began redirecting her programs toward more general ceremonial education. She could see that the specific skills of death assistance were becoming less valuable, but she correctly identified that the broader skills of crisis management and ceremonial coordination would remain relevant. Dr. Watanabe also demonstrated remarkable foresight, transitioning his practice toward what we would now call mental health services years before the final collapse of the ritual suicide system. His medical background gave him insights into the psychological dynamics driving cultural change that were invisible to practitioners focused purely on ceremonial traditions. But many Harakiri girls, particularly the most successful ones, failed to recognize the severity of the threat to their profession. They had invested so much in developing their expertise and building their reputations that acknowledging the permanent decline of their industry would have required admitting that their life's work was becoming worthless. This psychological resistance to change was understandable but ultimately counterproductive. The resistance to inevitable change took several forms, from political organizing to attempted innovation within the profession. Some practitioners tried to expand their services to include general ceremonial consulting, grief counseling, and family mediation, hoping to maintain their client relationships by serving broader needs. Others attempted to adapt their death assistance expertise to help people with modern problems like business failures, social scandals, and family conflicts. A few Harakiri girls even tried to reinvent their profession by offering their services to Western foreigners who were fascinated by Japanese culture but had no understanding of the social contexts that made ritual suicide meaningful. These cross-cultural ventures were generally unsuccessful, partly because foreigners lacked the cultural background to appreciate the subtleties of the service, and partly because the legal and social consequences of assisting suicide were much more severe under Western legal systems. The end of the Harakiri girl era didn't come through dramatic government prohibition or sudden cultural revolution, but rather through a gradual process of social irrelevance that was perhaps more devastating than outright persecution would have been. The profession simply faded away as Japanese society developed alternative institutions that served the same social functions without requiring anyone to die. The specific events that marked the end were surprisingly mundane. The last recorded ceremony assisted by a professional Harakiri girl took place in 1877 during the Satsuma Rebellion, when a group of traditional samurai attempted to restore the old ways through military action. Even this final ceremony was somewhat pathetic. The participants were elderly men who had been marginalized by social change, and their ritual suicide was viewed by most observers as an anachronistic gesture rather than a meaningful statement about honor and social responsibility. The final major players were women who had devoted their entire careers to death assistance and found themselves with expertise that nobody wanted anymore. Some attempted to continue practicing in secret, serving clients who still believed in the old ways despite social disapproval. Others tried to reinvent themselves as general counselors and ceremonial consultants, with varying degrees of success. Perhaps the most poignant figure was Chiyo, the Harakiri girl whose involvement in the Great Seppuku scandal had helped trigger the broader cultural examination of the profession. She spent her final years attempting to document the traditional practices and cultural knowledge that had developed within the industry, creating what amounted to an ethnographic record of her own disappearing profession. Chiyo's memoir, written under a pseudonym and published posthumously, provides one of the few detailed accounts of what it was actually like to work as a professional death assistant. Her descriptions of client relationships, professional rivalries, and the psychological challenges of helping people die gracefully offer insights into an aspect of Japanese culture that had been deliberately hidden from official historical records. The last attempts to preserve or continue the profession took various forms, from underground practice to academic study to artistic commemoration. Some former practitioners established what they called cultural preservation societies that maintained knowledge of traditional ceremonial practices while explicitly rejecting their deadly applications. These preservation efforts were partially successful in maintaining cultural knowledge, but they couldn't preserve the social context that had made Harakiri girls necessary in the first place. Traditional ceremonial knowledge became museum pieces and academic subjects rather than practical skills, fundamentally changing their meaning and significance. The dramatic final moments, to the extent that they existed, were more bureaucratic than theatrical. The last official acknowledgement of the profession came in 1878, when government records mentioned payments to ceremonial consultants who had assisted with the aftermath of the Satsuma Rebellion. After that, the profession disappeared from official documentation entirely. But perhaps the most symbolically significant end came when Kenji the blade merchant closed his workshop and melted down his inventory of ceremonial tanto to make farming implements. This practical transformation of weapons into tools perfectly captured the broader cultural shift from death-based honor to life-affirming productivity that characterized the Meiji Restoration. The gradual decline versus sudden end question is complicated by the fact that while the formal profession ended relatively quickly, some of its social functions continued to be served by other means for decades afterward. Former Harakiri girls continued to work as counselors, mediators, and ceremonial consultants well into the 20th century, though they no longer identified themselves with their original profession. Some symbolic endpoints persisted much longer than the practical profession. Traditional arts and cultural practices that had been influenced by Harakiri girl innovations continued to show their influence long after the death assistance industry had disappeared. Tea ceremony, flower arrangement, and other Japanese cultural practices retained elements of the aesthetic and psychological approaches that had been developed by professional death assistants. The final irony was that the end of the Harakiri girl profession represented a kind of ultimate success. They had helped Japanese society transition away from honor-based suicide so effectively that their own services were no longer needed. Their professional obsolescence was actually evidence of their contribution to cultural progress, though this philosophical comfort was probably small consolation to women who had lost their livelihoods and social status. The analysis of what caused the end of the Harakiri girl profession reveals a complex interaction of cultural, political, and economic factors that made their obsolescence inevitable once Japan committed to modernization. The fundamental issue wasn't that the services they provided were no longer valuable, but that the social system that made those services necessary was being systematically dismantled and replaced. Internal problems within the profession included the difficulty of maintaining social respectability while being associated with death, the challenge of training new practitioners when cultural values were shifting rapidly, and the economic vulnerability that came from serving a market that was shrinking due to factors beyond their control. The Great Seppuku Scandal had revealed that the profession could be easily discredited through association with inappropriate practices, making practitioners vulnerable to social backlash even when they were serving legitimate needs. The competitive rivalries between different schools had also created internal divisions that weakened the profession's ability to respond coherently to external challenges. But the more significant internal problem was that the profession had become too successful at serving the needs of a social system that was fundamentally dysfunctional. The Harakiri girls had made ritual suicide more accessible, dignified, and socially acceptable, which inadvertently helped perpetuate a system that progressive reformers wanted to eliminate entirely. External pressures were even more decisive in ending the profession. The influence of Western ideas about mental health, individual rights, and social organization provided intellectual frameworks for criticizing the entire honor-based suicide system. International pressure to conform to global standards of civilization made ritual suicide an embarrassment that hindered Japan's diplomatic and economic goals. The role of individuals versus historical forces in the profession's decline shows how personal decisions and broader cultural trends interacted in complex ways. Individual leaders like Dr. Watanabe played crucial roles in developing alternatives to ritual suicide, while specific scandals and policy decisions accelerated changes that were probably inevitable anyway. What could have been done differently is an interesting counterfactual question that reveals how thoroughly the profession was trapped by circumstances beyond their control. The Harakiri girls might have survived longer if they had adapted more quickly to changing social needs, but they couldn't have prevented the fundamental cultural shift that made their services unnecessary. Some practitioners did attempt to adapt by expanding their services to include general counseling, ceremonial consultation, and crisis mediation. These efforts were sometimes successful on an individual level, but they couldn't preserve the profession as a whole because they required abandoning the specialized expertise in death assistance that had defined the industry. The inevitability versus contingency question suggests that while specific timing and details of the profession's end were influenced by particular events and decisions, the broader trend toward elimination was probably unstoppable once Japan committed to modernization and international integration. The fundamental incompatibility between professional death assistance and modern approaches to social organization meant that the Harakiri girl profession was doomed as soon as Japanese leaders decided that ritual suicide was an obstacle to national progress rather than an expression of cultural virtue. This analysis reveals that occupational obsolescence can occur even when the services provided are technically excellent and meet genuine social needs, if those needs are themselves being redefined by broader cultural and political changes. The Harakiri girls weren't failures as professionals. They were victims of historical forces that made their expertise irrelevant, regardless of their individual competence or social value. The immediate aftermath of the Harakiri girl profession's disappearance was characterized by both relief and regret, as Japanese society struggled to process the loss of cultural practices that had been simultaneously valued and problematic. Who stepped into the vacuum left by their absence reveals how thoroughly their social functions had been integrated into Japanese culture and how difficult it was to replace them entirely. The most direct successors were the honor mediators and dignity coaches who had emerged during the transition period, but these new professionals served somewhat different functions and worked within different cultural frameworks. They focused on preventing the social crises that might previously have led to suicide, rather than managing the ceremonies that concluded such crises. Religious authorities, particularly Buddhist priests and Shinto officials, expanded their roles in providing counseling and spiritual guidance to people facing social difficulties. However, their approach was generally more focused on spiritual consolation and acceptance rather than the practical problem-solving and dignity preservation that had characterized Harakiri girl services. Government social workers and legal mediators also took over some functions that had previously been served by the death assistance industry, particularly in helping families resolve conflicts and restore social harmony after serious infractions. But these bureaucratic approaches often lacked the cultural sensitivity and personal attention that had made Harakiri girls effective. Short-term consequences included a temporary increase in unresolved social conflicts as people struggled to adapt to new ways of handling shame, honor disputes, and family crises. Some communities experienced what amounts to a social services gap, while new institutions developed the capacity to serve needs that had previously been met through the shadow economy of death assistance. Contemporary reactions were mixed and often conflicted. Progressive reformers celebrated the elimination of what they considered a barbaric practice that had held Japan back from achieving its potential as a modern nation. Traditional conservatives mourned the loss of cultural practices that they viewed as essential to Japanese spiritual and social identity. Many ordinary citizens felt ambivalent about changes that eliminated practices they had never wanted to use personally, but had found reassuring to know were available if needed. The existence of professional death assistance had provided a kind of cultural insurance policy that made the pressures of honor-based society more tolerable, and its absence created psychological anxieties that took years to resolve. Attempts at revival or continuation were generally unsuccessful, partly because the social conditions that had made the profession necessary had been permanently altered, and partly because the cultural stigma associated with death assistance made it difficult to attract new practitioners or clients. Some former practitioners did attempt to maintain aspects of their profession through underground practice or cultural preservation societies, but these efforts were marginal and had little influence on broader social development. The knowledge and skills that had been developed within the industry were gradually lost or transformed beyond recognition as they were adapted to serve different purposes in changed social contexts. The immediate legacy was thus characterized more by absence than presence, by the gap left when social functions that had been served effectively, if controversially, were suddenly no longer available. The legacy of the Harakiri girl profession shaped later Japanese social development in ways that were often invisible but remarkably persistent. While the specific practice of professional death assistance disappeared, the innovations in crisis management, ceremonial organization, and psychological support that had emerged from this shadow industry continued to influence Japanese approaches to social problems for generations. One of the most significant long-term influences was on the development of Japan's approach to mental health and social services. Many of the techniques that Harakiri girls had developed for helping people cope with shame, maintain dignity under pressure, and find meaning in difficult circumstances were quietly incorporated into modern counseling and therapeutic practices, though their origins were rarely acknowledged. The emphasis on preserving dignity and maintaining social harmony that had characterized the best Harakiri girl practices became central features of Japanese social work and conflict resolution systems. Modern Japanese approaches to family mediation, workplace counseling, and community mental health services show clear influences from the holistic, relationship-focused methods that had been pioneered by professional death assistants. How later, generations viewed the profession evolved significantly over time, reflecting broader changes in Japanese society's relationship with its own history. During the early Meiji period, the Harakiri girls were generally viewed as embarrassing remnants of a barbaric past that progressive Japan needed to leave behind. This negative assessment persisted through the early 20th century as Japan worked to establish its credentials as a modern, civilized nation. But during the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, some scholars and cultural critics began to reassess the profession more positively, recognizing that the Harakiri girls had represented a form of women's economic and social empowerment that was remarkable for its historical context. This reappraisal was part of a broader movement to examine Japanese history more critically and acknowledge aspects of traditional culture that had been dismissed or forgotten during the rush to modernize. The myths versus realities that developed around the profession show how historical memory can be shaped by contemporary concerns and cultural needs. Popular culture began to romanticize the Harakiri girls as tragic heroines who had helped preserve traditional Japanese values in the face of social change, while academic historians worked to develop more accurate and nuanced understandings of their actual roles and social significance. One persistent myth was that Harakiri girls had been passive victims of a patriarchal system rather than active entrepreneurs who had found ways to build successful careers within restrictive social conditions. This romanticized view ignored the evidence that many practitioners had been skilled businesswomen who had exercised considerable agency and social influence within their chosen profession. Another myth was that the profession had been uniformly grim and morbid, when in fact many practitioners had found meaning, purpose, and even satisfaction in their work, helping people navigate some of life's most difficult challenges. The assumption that any profession associated with death must necessarily be depressing reflected modern biases rather than historical realities. Why the profession remained important or was forgotten depended largely on broader cultural and political trends in Japanese society. During periods when Japan was emphasizing its unique cultural identity, the Harakiri girls were sometimes remembered as examples of distinctively Japanese approaches to social problems. During periods focused on international integration and modernization, they were more likely to be forgotten or dismissed as irrelevant anachronisms. The profession's historical impact was also shaped by the fact that much of their knowledge and many of their innovations had been preserved and transmitted through other channels, even after the profession itself disappeared. Former practitioners who had transitioned to careers in counseling, social work, and ceremonial arts continued to apply their expertise in new contexts, ensuring that valuable techniques and insights weren't completely lost. Perhaps most significantly, the Harakiri girl phenomenon had demonstrated that even the most restrictive social systems contained opportunities for innovation, entrepreneurship, and social change, providing historical precedents that later generations of Japanese women could draw upon in their own struggles for economic independence and professional recognition. Today, we can see echoes of the Harakiri girl phenomenon in numerous contemporary situations where social problems create demand for professional services that operate in legal or cultural grey areas. The basic pattern, innovative individuals finding ways to serve unmet social needs while navigating complex ethical and legal challenges, appears repeatedly in modern contexts. One of the most obvious parallels is in the contemporary death industry, where professionals like death doulas, suicide prevention counselors, and end-of-life coaches serve functions that are remarkably similar to what Harakiri girls provided in feudal Japan. These modern practitioners help people navigate the psychological, social, and logistical challenges of death and dying while operating in professional spaces that are often poorly defined and inadequately regulated. Like their historical predecessors, modern death professionals often work with clients who are facing some of their most vulnerable and emotionally charged moments, requiring exceptional skills in crisis management, emotional support, and family dynamics. They also operate in fields where traditional medical and legal professionals may be unable or unwilling to provide the kind of holistic, relationship-focused support that clients need. The business of managing social shame and reputation rehabilitation shows even more direct parallels to the Harakiri girl profession. Modern crisis management consultants, public relations specialists who handle scandal recovery, and social media reputation managers serve remarkably similar functions to the honor mediators and dignity coaches who emerged from the Harakiri girl community. These contemporary professionals help clients navigate public embarrassment, professional failure, and social media cancellation in ways that preserve their dignity and social relationships while minimizing long-term damage to their reputations. Like the Harakiri girls, they operate in fields that require deep understanding of social psychology, cultural norms, and the complex dynamics of shame and redemption. The rise of professional life coaching, therapy, and counseling services reflects many of the same social needs that had created demand for Harakiri girl services. The need for expert guidance in managing psychological pressure, social expectations, and personal crises that individuals and families can't handle effectively on their own. Modern therapeutic approaches that emphasize dignity preservation, cultural sensitivity, and holistic support show clear conceptual similarities to the methods that had been developed by the most successful Harakiri girl practitioners. The emphasis on helping clients find meaning and purpose in difficult circumstances while maintaining their social relationships and cultural identity reflects techniques that were pioneered in the death assistance industry. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental need for professional support during life's most challenging moments, the importance of maintaining dignity and social connection in the face of failure or crisis, and the tendency for innovative individuals to create new professional services when existing institutions can't meet emerging social needs. People continue to struggle with shame, social pressure, and the challenge of maintaining honor and respect within their communities. The specific manifestations of these challenges have changed. We worry about online reputation rather than family honor, professional failure rather than samurai duty, social media shaming rather than ritual suicide. But the underlying psychological and social dynamics remain remarkably consistent. Similar patterns in different contexts include the emergence of shadow industries around socially sensitive issues, the development of professional expertise in areas that mainstream institutions avoid or handle poorly, and the tendency for regulatory and social recognition to lag behind the development of new forms of professional service. Contemporary issues like cyberbullying, cancel culture, social media addiction, and online harassment create social pressures and psychological challenges that are structurally very similar to those that had made Harakiri girls necessary in feudal Japan. Modern society has developed new institutions and professional services to address these challenges, but the basic pattern of social pressure leading to extreme responses that require professional intervention remains unchanged. The lesson for contemporary society is that social problems requiring extreme solutions usually indicate underlying institutional inadequacies that need to be addressed through systemic change rather than just individual intervention. Just as Japan eventually needed to reform its entire approach to honor and social discipline rather than just improve its death assistance services, modern societies may need fundamental changes in how they handle shame, failure, and social conflict, rather than just better crisis management services. The Harakiri girl phenomenon offers several key takeaways that remain relevant for understanding how societies can better address the intersection between individual crisis and social expectations. Perhaps most importantly, their story demonstrates that when official institutions fail to serve essential social needs, innovative individuals will often create alternative systems that fill those gaps, regardless of legal or cultural obstacles. 1. Universal truth revealed by the Harakiri girl profession is that the need for professional support during psychological and social crises is fundamental to human societies, and that this support is most effective when it comes from specialists who understand both the technical and cultural dimensions of the challenges people face. The most successful Harakiri girls weren't just skilled in ceremonial protocols, they were experts in human psychology, family dynamics, and social navigation. The warning for today is that societies that create intense social pressure without providing adequate support systems for people who fail to meet expectations will inevitably develop either destructive coping mechanisms or shadow industries that serve these needs outside official channels. Modern phenomena like cyberbullying, cancel culture, and social media shaming create pressures that are structurally similar to those that made ritual suicide seem necessary in feudal Japan. The inspirational elements of the Harakiri girl story include the remarkable entrepreneurship and professional competence that these women demonstrated in creating successful careers under extremely challenging circumstances. They proved that it was possible to find dignity, purpose, and economic independence even in professions that seemed inherently limiting or socially problematic. Their story also demonstrates the importance of professional standards, ethical guidelines, and community support in fields that deal with vulnerable populations and sensitive social issues. The most successful practitioners were those who developed clear ethical frameworks and maintained strong professional networks that helped them navigate complex moral and social challenges. Practical lessons for contemporary society include the need for better integration between crisis intervention services and broader social support systems, the importance of developing professional expertise in shame management and reputation rehabilitation, and the value of creating legitimate channels for addressing social problems before they escalate to crisis levels. The Harakiri girl phenomenon also illustrates the importance of understanding the cultural context in which social problems develop, rather than trying to apply universal solutions to culturally specific challenges. Their approaches were effective because they worked within Japanese cultural frameworks rather than trying to impose foreign concepts of individual psychology and social organization. Why this history matters now is that modern societies face many similar challenges in balancing individual welfare against social expectations, managing the psychological costs of social pressure, and developing effective approaches to shame, failure, and reputation management. The specific solutions that worked in feudal Japan may not be directly applicable to contemporary problems, but the underlying principles of holistic support, cultural sensitivity, and professional expertise remain relevant. Perhaps most importantly, the Harakiri girl story demonstrates that social progress often requires not just eliminating harmful practices, but also developing effective alternatives that serve the same essential functions through more constructive means. Simply prohibiting destructive behaviors without addressing the underlying needs that make them seem necessary is likely to result in the emergence of new problems rather than genuine solutions. Even now, the legacy of the Harakiri girl profession continues to influence several areas of modern Japanese society and international understanding of cultural adaptation and professional innovation. Academic study of the profession has contributed to broader scholarly understanding of women's economic history, the development of service industries, and the relationship between cultural change and professional obsolescence. Universities in Japan and internationally have incorporated the Harakiri girl phenomenon into courses on Japanese history, women's studies, and the sociology of professions, using their story as a case study in how marginalized groups can create economic opportunities within restrictive social systems. This academic attention has helped preserve knowledge about the profession while also contributing to broader theoretical understanding of entrepreneurship and social innovation. Popular culture has shown continued fascination with the profession, though often in romanticized or sensationalized forms that don't accurately reflect the historical reality. Films, novels, and manga that feature Harakiri girls as characters have helped maintain public awareness of the profession while also perpetuating some myths and misconceptions about their actual roles and social significance. Political discourse in modern Japan occasionally references the Harakiri girl phenomenon when discussing issues related to social pressure, mental health policy, and the balance between traditional values and modern approaches to social problems. Some politicians and social critics have used the profession as either a positive or negative example, depending on their views about cultural preservation versus modernization. The influence on social movements has been particularly significant. In Japanese feminism and women's rights advocacy, the Harakiri girls have been cited as historical examples of women who achieved economic independence and professional recognition despite severe social restrictions, providing precedents for contemporary arguments about women's capabilities and potential contributions to society. International observers studying Japanese culture and social organization have used the Harakiri girl profession as a lens for understanding broader patterns in how societies manage cultural change, professional adaptation, and the intersection between tradition and innovation. Their story has contributed to comparative studies of how different cultures handle similar challenges related to honor, shame, and social pressure. Why people still care about this historical phenomenon reflects ongoing concerns about social pressure, mental health, and the relationship between individual welfare and social expectations that remain relevant in contemporary society. The basic questions that the Harakiri girl profession raised about the proper role of professional assistance in personal crises, the ethics of commercializing deeply personal experiences, and the balance between cultural preservation and social progress continue to be debated in modern contexts. The profession's continuing influence also reflects broader interest in recovering and understanding aspects of women's history that have been marginalized or forgotten in traditional historical narratives. As societies become more interested in understanding the full range of human experience and economic activity, previously overlooked professions like the Harakiri girls gain new relevance and significance. Perhaps most importantly, the Harakiri girl phenomenon continues to serve as a reminder that even the most restrictive social systems contain opportunities for innovation, adaptation, and change, and that individuals facing seemingly impossible circumstances can sometimes find ways to create meaning, purpose, and even prosperity within those constraints. This message remains relevant for people facing their own challenges in navigating complex social and professional environments. Looking back across the remarkable story of Japan's Harakiri girls, we've seen how a shadow industry emerged from one of history's most unusual social needs, evolved into a sophisticated professional network, and ultimately transformed itself out of existence as Japanese society modernized. The major themes that have emerged from this journey reveal as much about human adaptability and entrepreneurship as they do about the specific cultural context of feudal Japan. We began with the discovery that what most people assumed was a tragic story of women helping others die was actually a complex tale of business innovation, professional rivalry, and social entrepreneurship. The Harakiri girls weren't victims of a barbaric system, they were skilled professionals who identified an unmet social need and developed sophisticated services to address it, creating successful careers in the process. The key patterns that emerged include the tendency for shadow industries to develop around socially sensitive needs that official institutions can't or won't address, the importance of professional standards and ethical frameworks in maintaining legitimacy for controversial services, and the inevitability of obsolescence when the social conditions that create demand for specific services undergo fundamental change. Perhaps most surprising was discovering how thoroughly integrated the death assistance industry had become with broader Japanese society involving not just the Harakiri girls themselves but also blade merchants, medical specialists, training supervisors, and entire networks of supporting businesses. What appeared to be a marginal profession serving occasional individual needs was actually a significant economic sector that employed hundreds of people and influenced broader cultural development. The most important takeaways from this historical journey include the recognition that innovative individuals can create meaningful careers even within the most restrictive social systems, that professional expertise can develop in unexpected areas when social needs are strong enough, and that cultural change often requires not just eliminating harmful practices, but also developing effective alternatives that serve the same essential functions. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reflects the complexity of making moral and cultural judgments about historical practices that served real social needs, even when they involved elements that modern sensibilities find disturbing. The Harakiri girls weren't simply enablers of a barbaric practice, they were creative problem solvers who helped people navigate some of life's most difficult challenges while working within the cultural constraints of their time and place. The journey has also revealed how historical narratives can be shaped by contemporary biases and assumptions that prevent us from understanding the full complexity of past experiences. The tendency to view any profession associated with death as inherently tragic or exploitative obscures the agency, skill, and social contribution of the women who chose this challenging career path. Most fundamentally, the story of the Harakiri girls demonstrates that human societies are constantly creating new forms of professional service and social organization in response to changing needs and circumstances, and that these innovations often emerge from the margins of society rather than from established institutions. Understanding how these processes work provides insights into contemporary social and economic development that extend far beyond the specific historical context of feudal Japan. Perhaps most fascinatingly, the Harakiri girl phenomenon reveals fundamental insights about human nature that transcend the specific cultural context of feudal Japan and remain relevant for understanding how people navigate social pressure, professional challenges, and moral complexity in any era. What stays constant across time and culture is the human need for professional support during life's most difficult moments, the tendency for innovative individuals to create new solutions when existing institutions fail to meet emerging needs, and the importance of maintaining dignity and social connection even in the most challenging circumstances. The Harakiri girls succeeded because they understood these universal human needs and developed sophisticated approaches to serving them. What changes across different historical contexts are the specific manifestations of social pressure, the particular forms that professional innovation takes, and the cultural frameworks that people use to understand and justify their choices. The Harakiri girls operated within concepts of honor and social obligation that were specific to Japanese culture, but their underlying functions, crisis management, psychological support, and social navigation, are universal human needs. How people adapt to changing circumstances reveals remarkable creativity and resilience when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. The Harakiri girls developed an entire professional infrastructure around one of the most difficult and sensitive aspects of human experience, creating economic opportunities for women in a society that offered them few alternatives while simultaneously serving essential social functions. The universal struggles that the profession addressed include the challenge of maintaining personal dignity in the face of social disapproval, the need for expert guidance during psychological and social crises, and the difficulty of balancing individual welfare against collective expectations. These struggles appear in different forms across all human societies and historical periods. Timeless motivations revealed by the Harakiri girl story include the desire for economic independence and professional recognition, the satisfaction that comes from helping others navigate difficult circumstances, and the human capacity to find meaning and purpose even in professions that others might consider morbid or morally questionable. The profession also demonstrates how people can develop ethical frameworks and professional standards, even in fields that operate outside conventional moral and legal boundaries. The most successful Harakiri girls weren't just technically skilled, they were thoughtful practitioners who developed sophisticated approaches to the moral and psychological challenges inherent in their work. Perhaps most importantly, the Harakiri girl phenomenon reveals how human nature includes both remarkable adaptability and stubborn consistency. People's fundamental psychological and social needs remain relatively constant, but their approaches to meeting those needs can evolve dramatically in response to changing circumstances and cultural conditions. The story also illustrates how individual agency and structural constraints interact in complex ways that defy simple categorization. The Harakiri girls were simultaneously empowered entrepreneurs who created successful careers and marginalized workers whose opportunities were limited by restrictive social systems. They exercised remarkable creativity and professional skill, while operating within cultural frameworks that modern observers might find oppressive. This complexity reflects a broader truth about human experience, that people rarely fit neatly into categories of victim or agent, traditional or innovative, moral or immoral. The Harakiri girls were all of these things simultaneously, depending on the perspective from which their story is viewed and the criteria used to evaluate their choices and contributions. The ultimate insight about human nature from the Harakiri girl phenomenon is that people have an extraordinary capacity to create meaning, purpose, and even prosperity within whatever circumstances they face, no matter how restrictive or challenging those circumstances might appear to outside observers. This adaptability and creativity represents one of the most inspiring aspects of human experience across all historical periods and cultural contexts. To understand what the Harakiri girl phenomenon ultimately represents, consider the story of Yuki's final ceremony, not a seppuku, but the closing celebration she organized for her own retirement from the death assistance profession in 1876. After 30 years of helping others die with dignity, she decided to help herself transition to a new life with similar grace and ceremony. Yuki had been one of the most successful practitioners of the Edo efficiency movement, known for her no-nonsense approach to ritual suicide and her ability to help clients achieve dignified deaths without unnecessary drama or artificial enhancement. But as demand for her services declined and social attitudes shifted, she recognized that her profession was ending and that she needed to find new ways to apply her skills and experience. Her retirement ceremony was attended by former clients, families, rival practitioners who had become friends, and the network of supporting professionals who had helped make her career possible. Instead of focusing on death, the ceremony celebrated life, professional achievement, and successful adaptation to changing circumstances. Yuki used the occasion to announce her new career as a conflict mediator and family counselor, explaining how the skills she had developed in death assistance would serve her well in helping people resolve their problems without requiring extreme solutions. She had already begun working with several families to address honor disputes through dialogue and negotiation rather than ritual suicide. What made this story particularly meaningful was how it captured the broader transformation that was taking place throughout Japanese society. Yuki's ceremony represented not just one woman's career change, but a cultural shift toward life-affirming approaches to honor, dignity, and social problem-solving. The guests at her retirement celebration included Dr. Watanabe, who had successfully transitioned from ceremonial medicine to mental health services, and Grandmother Masa, who had transformed her Harakiri girl training programs into one of Japan's first professional schools for women in social services. Even Kenji the blade merchant was present, having recently opened a new business manufacturing farming tools and household implements. The ceremony itself demonstrated how innovations that had emerged from the death assistance industry could be adapted for more positive purposes. Yuki used many of the same techniques for managing group psychology, creating meaningful ritual experiences and helping people process complex emotions that she had developed as a Harakiri girl, but applied them to celebration rather than mourning. Perhaps most symbolically, the ceremony concluded with Yuki presenting her ceremonial tanto to a local shrine, where it would be permanently displayed as a historical artifact rather than a functional tool. This act represented the transformation of instruments of death into objects of cultural memory and education. The story encapsulates the broader themes of our exploration because it shows how the same human qualities that had made the Harakiri girls successful, creativity, professional skill, psychological insight, and cultural sensitivity, could be redirected toward life-affirming purposes when social conditions changed. The women who had built their careers around helping others die with dignity proved equally capable of helping people live with dignity once that became their society's priority. Yuki's retirement ceremony also demonstrates how historical transitions can be managed with grace and wisdom when people are willing to acknowledge what was valuable about past practices while embracing necessary changes. Her approach honored the profession she was leaving while enthusiastically embracing the opportunities that lay ahead. This final story reveals that the Harakiri girl phenomenon was ultimately about human adaptability, professional excellence, and the capacity to find meaning and purpose regardless of circumstances, qualities that remain as relevant today as they were in feudal Japan. In the end, the story of Japan's Harakiri girls reminds us that human societies are constantly creating and recreating themselves through the innovative efforts of individuals who identify unmet needs and develop creative solutions to address them, regardless of social constraints or cultural expectations. The connection to modern life is profound and multifaceted, we continue to struggle with many of the same fundamental challenges that made Harakiri girls necessary in feudal Japan: social pressure, reputation management, the need for professional support during personal crises, and the challenge of maintaining dignity in difficult circumstances. While our specific approaches have evolved, the underlying human needs remain remarkably consistent. What we should remember from the Harakiri girl phenomenon is that innovation often emerges from unexpected places and takes forms that challenge conventional assumptions about what is possible or appropriate. The women who created this profession demonstrated that even the most restrictive social systems contain opportunities for creativity, entrepreneurship, and meaningful work. Their story also reminds us that professional obsolescence doesn't necessarily represent failure. Sometimes it represents success so complete that the original problem no longer exists. The Harakiri girls helped Japanese society transition away from honor-based suicide so effectively that their own services became unnecessary, which is perhaps the highest form of professional achievement imaginable. How history informs the present, in this case, involves recognizing that contemporary social problems often require innovative professional responses that may not fit neatly into existing categories or institutional frameworks. The development of new forms of crisis intervention, mental health support, and social services continues to follow patterns that were pioneered by the Harakiri girls centuries ago. The final thought-provoking observation from this exploration is that moral and cultural judgments about historical practices often reveal more about contemporary biases than about the actual experiences of people in the past. The Harakiri girls created meaningful careers and provided valuable services within their cultural context, even though their profession involved elements that modern sensibilities find disturbing. This suggests that we should approach historical evaluation with humility and recognition that our own practices and professions may appear equally strange or problematic to future generations. The standards we use to judge the past are inevitably shaped by our contemporary circumstances and may not be entirely appropriate for understanding different historical contexts. Perhaps most importantly, the Harakiri girl story demonstrates that human creativity and adaptability are powerful forces that can transform even the most challenging circumstances into opportunities for growth, meaning, and social contribution. This message of resilience and innovation remains relevant for anyone facing their own professional or personal challenges in navigating complex social environments. The ultimate lesson may be that history is made not just by famous leaders and major events, but also by ordinary people who find extraordinary ways to serve essential human needs, regardless of the obstacles they face or the recognition they receive for their contributions. As we conclude this journey through one of history's most unusual professions, we're left with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of human experience and the remarkable ways that people can create meaning, purpose, and even prosperity in the most unexpected circumstances. The Harakiri girls remind us that every era presents both challenges and opportunities, and that innovation often emerges from the margins of society rather than from its center. Their story encourages us to look beyond surface assumptions and easy moral judgments to understand the full complexity of how people navigate difficult circumstances and serve essential social needs. In our own time, as we face new forms of social pressure, professional uncertainty, and cultural change, we might find inspiration in their example of creativity, adaptability, and professional excellence under challenging conditions. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of a forgotten chapter of human history that reveals timeless truths about resilience, innovation, and the enduring human capacity to find dignity and purpose in any circumstances. The Harakiri girls may be gone, but their legacy of creative problem-solving and professional dedication continues to offer insights for our own journeys through an uncertain world.